Start.
Go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the next and upcoming session in which we will have our featured plenary speaker, Dr. Bethany Kwan. Dr. Kwan is Associate Professor and Associate Vice Chair for Research in the Department of Emergency Medicine at the University of Colorado School of Medicine and Schutz Medical Campus. She received her PhD in Social Psychology from the University of Colorado Boulder in 2010, following a Master of Science in Public Health from the University of Colorado Health Sciences Center in 2005. She holds a BS in Chemistry and Psychology from Carnegie Mellon University in 2001. As an investigator in the University of Colorado's Adult and Child Consortium for Health Outcomes Research and Delivery Science, or ACCORDS, she conducts pragmatic patient-centered research and evaluation on health and healthcare in a variety of areas. With an emphasis on stakeholder engagement and dissemination implementation methods, her work addresses the integration of physical and behavioral health, chronic disease self-management, improving processes and systems of care to achieve the quadruple aim, pragmatic trials using electronic health data, and enhancing quality of life for patients and care partners. She works with patients and other stakeholders at all phases of research, from prioritization to design, implementation, and dissemination of research. She mentors and teaches students, trainees, and fellow faculty on designing for dissemination to ensure that research innovations are efficiently and effectively adopted, used, and sustained in real-world settings to improve health and well-being for all. Dr. Kwan directs the ACCORDS educational program, as well as the Colorado Clinical and Translational Science Institute, or the CCTSI, Dissemination and Implementation Core. With that, I give you our plenary speaker for this afternoon, Dr. Bethany Kwan.
Thank you so much, Dr. McNeil. I appreciate the introduction. Welcome all back from lunch. I hope you all had some nourishment. So today I will be talking about principles, methods, and systems for designing for dissemination, sustainability, and equity. The learning objectives for this session are to describe the principles of designing for dissemination, sustainability, and equity, which I'll refer to as D4D, D4DS, D4DSE, depends on what I'm talking about, including beginning with the end in mind, ensuring innovation context fit, and planning for active dissemination. Another objective is to be able to identify frameworks and methods useful for designing and disseminating a range of research projects from a D4DSE perspective, and to describe the phases of the new fit to context framework for D4D. Why is designing for dissemination and sustainability important to consider? Where there are three main barriers to dissemination and sustainability of the products of our research that we need to address. Number one is the poor fit between health innovations and the intended context for use. We heard a lot this morning about how important it was to know who was going to be using the products of your research and whether this was in alignment with their priorities, their goals, their needs, their perspectives. Next, we struggle with research paradigms that are used to develop and test programs. Our traditional randomized controlled trial design is fantastic for producing efficacy evidence, but it is not as good for establishing evidence that helps us know what will actually work in real world settings. And finally, we've also heard a number of times this morning around the cultures and systems that fail to incentivize and support active dissemination and translation of evidence into practice. At the end of this talk, I hope that you'll see a number of strategies and ways that you can go about integrating D4DS perspectives into your research. When I refer to designing for dissemination and sustainability, I'm talking about principles and methods for enhancing the fit between a health program, policy, or practice, and the context in which it is intended to be adopted. It also refers to principles and methods for early and active dissemination and sustainability planning. Designing for dissemination specifically refers to the process of ensuring that the products of research are developed to match the contextual characteristics of the target audience and setting for intended use, where designing for sustainability refers to early planning and design processes designed to increase the likelihood of sustainment of an evidence-based program or practice after initial implementation. I also want to talk a little bit about designing for equity. We heard this morning that often it's implicit in the work that we're doing in working with communities that we want to address equity, that we want to improve health equity. Well, how do we actually go about doing that? And there are a number of theories and frameworks and opinion pieces, editorials around how do we actually go about establishing equity. This EQDI framework is a recent framework that was introduced by some colleagues at the University of Rochester and other places on how to integrate elements of social determinants of health with D&I in order to improve health equity. And so as you think about designing for dissemination, also be thinking about what are aspects of context that we need to address, aspects of social determinants of health that need to be addressed and attended to in the design of our research products and how they're disseminated and sustained. When I talk about the products of research or our innovations, that which we are designing to be disseminated, there are 6 different categories that we have found that your research might fit into. Number 1 is, in general, evidence, the generalizable knowledge resulting from the conduct of research and evaluation. In general, all research should be producing evidence. Next, we might be talking about programs, treatments, interventions, and services, a thing. You have a thing that you're trying to get people to do, to engage in, that's meant to improve their health. There's technology and infrastructure, such as devices, software, hardware, web-based, and other tools and equipment for disease prevention or management, for the conduct of research, evaluation, or educational purposes. There are dissemination and implementation strategies that in and of themselves can be the product of research. These are methods, approaches, guides, or materials for dissemination, implementation, and sustainment of effective, equitable, and efficient public health and healthcare practices. Our products might be policies and guidelines. They can be local small p policy, they can be national big P policy, public health and healthcare guidelines, standards, and policies that emerge from the evidence base. Or we might be disseminating our methods, the research and evaluation techniques, our models, our theories, our measures, instruments, tools, equipment we have developed as part of the products of research that we're disseminating. When we approach research from a designing for dissemination, sustainability, and equity perspective, there are 3 main principles that we'd like you to keep in mind. Number 1 is this concept of beginning with the end in mind. Who here has heard that phrase before, beginning with the end in mind? Yes. The next one is ensuring innovation context fit, and then planning for active dissemination and sustainment. And I'll go through each one of these. In Greek mythology, Prometheus was a Titan god of forethought, the creator of human civilization, and known for intellectual and craftsman pursuits. Molding humans from water and clay, Prometheus provided humans with the practical tools and knowledge they would need to not only survive, but to grow and improve over time, including fire, science, and the arts. Prometheus championed the cause of humans against the gods to his great peril. His cunning and forethought and ability to outwit the gods is lauded, in contrast with the foolishness and lack of foresight of his brother Epimetheus, which means afterthought. Prometheus, one might say, is the origin story of beginning with the end in mind. In recent years, we've increasingly come to recognize that our traditional approach to health research is more Epimethean in nature. We design and test health interventions, programs, and service delivery models using tightly controlled scientific methods to establish efficacy and grow our knowledge. Thank you to Prometheus. We publish our efficacy trials in academic journals. Then sometimes we move towards dissemination beyond academic audiences, and perhaps we evaluate population health impact and advocate for policy changes that enable sustainability. Dissemination, impact, and sustainability are afterthoughts or someone else's job. There is evidence showing that many scientists perceive that actually getting the word out, disseminating the results of our work is someone else's job. We don't know whose job it is. I'm arguing it is our job. It is important for us to take that on as part of the work that we do, to factor it into our grant proposals as part of our program initiatives, and not stop until the evidence that you've generated, the products you've generated, have been made available to all who may benefit. In adopting a designing for dissemination perspective and beginning with the end in mind, Scientists really should start by considering who will ultimately benefit from uptake and use of your research product and who may not, and if these expected benefits are likely to be equitable. Consider who will need to change practice or policy, who will need to invest resources, who will need to develop new skills or apply skills in new ways. There are a number of different ways of conceptualizing your target audience and their desired impact. We heard this morning from Dr. Doug Luke about the translational sciences benefits model and the many different ways we might conceptualize impact of our work. I encourage you also to think about the adopters, the influencers of decisions about who will adopt the products of our work, as well as potential saboteurs, not necessarily people who will purposely try to undermine you, but those for whom your research is not a priority or that directly conflicts with something that they're trying to achieve. I also really like the socio-ecological model in thinking about the many different levels of impact that my research might have and who at each level I need to consider. The second principle of ensuring innovation context fit refers to when the products of research are developed in ways that match the needs, resources, workflows, and contextual characteristics of the target audience and setting. That is, designing for dissemination means ensuring research products fit the context of intended use, both at the outset and over time. You might hear similar terminology: problem solution fit, innovation context fit, all part of this product context or innovation context fit. An important aspect of innovation context fit is having a complete understanding of your context. And I reference here the practical, robust implementation and sustainability model, which is a fantastic model for helping you to describe the context of intended use of your product. The innovation context fit is also relevant when considering the wider multi-sector systems in which your organizations are situated: health, transport, education systems. And an innovation designed for fit to organizational context will align with the organizational goals and capacity for change, their readiness for change, thus enhancing the receptiveness of the organization to investing in adoption of the innovation. And we have a number of presenters later in this conference who will be talking all about assessing systems, assessing system fit, or an organizational readiness for change. This organizational readiness for change framework is just one example of how you might go about conceptualizing system capacity and organizational readiness to determine, is your innovation, is your research product something that is available to or accessible to those who may be using it. The third principle is active dissemination and sustainability planning. Dissemination refers to an active approach of spreading evidence-based interventions to the target audience via determined channels using planned strategies. And we often contrast this with diffusion or passive diffusion, meaning I've put it out in the world, I'm just going to wait and see who takes up and uses my product. Whereas an active dissemination planning approach uses an audience segmentation, targeted messaging approach to make sure that the right people are getting the right message at the right time. And in our last session around the dissemination consult service, we talked a lot about the importance of timing. And dissemination really does have a lot to do with that right timing of your message. In planning for active dissemination, I really like Bauman's 6-step dissemination framework, where they talk about these 6 different steps. Number 1 being to describe your innovation, the rationale, the evidence base underlying it. To identify your target audience and the sequence, timing, and format for dissemination. To select the communication channels. How does your audience receive information? Do you know that? Is that something that you've established in your context assessment, that you know how your different audience members get information and when and where? Number 4 is to determine the role of key policymakers and partnerships. I argue this should ideally even come first. Number 5 is to identify barriers and facilitators for dissemination. This is a great opportunity for both community engagement and mixed methods research. And then finally, to conduct research and to evaluate the dissemination process. Is this reaching those who need to hear it? Are people actually adopting your innovation, your products, as a result of being in contact with your dissemination strategy? As just a brief example here, we have a project that we called MAB Colorado. This was a project to design a dissemination strategy for monoclonal antibodies for the treatment of high-risk outpatients with COVID-19. And one of the things that we did in this project is we conducted a series of community engagement studios with 6 different audience types in the state of Colorado to understand what types of messages would resonate. What are the visuals, the way that we could package the information that would best reach them? We partnered with communication specialists, graphic designers, video producers to create all these different ways of packaging the information about how to access monoclonal antibodies. We also asked about, well, what are the trusted sources of information and channels by which our community partners would receive information? And through these community engagement studios, we also identified the wide variety of ways that they might receive information. Radio and newsletters and newspapers really rose to the top as ways that people received information about the prevention and treatment of COVID-19. And so in designing our dissemination strategy, we made heavy use of those channels. After identifying our active dissemination plan, or in the context of identifying our active dissemination plan, in designing our products for dissemination and sustainability, there are a number of design processes that you might use. And in this review paper, in the annual review of public health that just came out this year, we identified 6 categories of design processes. That is the methods, frameworks, or approaches we might use to develop and test a research product, the product messages, packaging and distribution plans, and sustainability plans. First, participatory co-design and stakeholder involvement is really the place to start. I strongly recommend, no matter what you're doing and designing for dissemination, to have community partners, to have those with a vested interest in the outcomes of your research, to be working with you all along the way in planning and conduct and dissemination of your research. In dissemination implementation science in particular, there's a heavy emphasis on application of theories and frameworks. You would never write a grant proposal to go to NIH, to a D&I study section without applying a D&I theory or framework. There's also a number of marketing and business approaches that you might use, especially when you're trying to market to health systems about how they might adopt your innovations. Context and situation analysis is really critical for doing an assessment of, well, what's the context I need to fit? Systems engineering and complexity science approaches are helpful for understanding the broad set of systems and multiple determinants of what impacts the adoption, implementation, and sustainment of your product. And then finally, communication in the arts is also a really valuable set of expertise to have on your team to help you as you construct your messages and plan your packaging. As I mentioned, working with a lot of graphic designers and communication specialists and experts on our team for the MAB project. A little bit more detail on these design processes. When you're thinking about stakeholder engagement, community partner engagement, I really like the 7 Ps framework that encourages you to think about patients in the public, providers, policymakers, purchasers, payers, product makers, principal investigators, all words starting with P, as potential adopters, influencers, and saboteurs of your project. And so we have a stakeholder engagement matrix that we encourage our students to use in our Designing for Dissemination course to think about all these different types of audiences that you might need to design for in your research. I do want to point out that the term stakeholder, while used pretty heavily in dissemination implementation science and health services research, has increasingly been recognized as having a basis in colonialism. And so we're working to move away from that terminology. So you might hear community partners, you might hear language like invested parties. However, you might think about referring to those that you're partnering with, those with a vested interest in the outcomes of your research, and moving away from that term stakeholder to be more precise about who it is that you're designing for is recommended. Other participatory co-design methods that you might consider in your research include this experience-based co-design type of approach, human-centered design, design thinking types of methods, community engagement studios like we used in our MAB project. Those are all potential strategies you might use for co-design. To help you with this process, we used design thinking to create the dicemethods.org tool. And this is an engagement method navigator web tool for clinical and translational science. It's available for free at dicemethods.org. This is an example of a visual abstract that we developed to share how this tool was actually developed using design thinking methods and principles. Regarding application of dissemination implementation science process frameworks, the EPIS framework, exploration, preparation, implementation, and sustainment framework, is an excellent framework if you're thinking about how do I start from the very beginning, begin with the end in mind, assess the context, engage my partners, understand their resources and how they might receive my innovation or how we might develop a product together. How do we match this product that we're developing to both the inner context and the outer context so that it is both sustainable and feasible to use in real world settings? Understanding context, I already mentioned, is critically important. The EPIS framework also has some strategies for helping you to understand context. And then I already mentioned PRISM, which is the context framework that expands upon REAIM, the reach, effectiveness, adoption, implementation, and maintenance framework. Context and situation analysis refers to a formal assessment of the audience, needs, settings, workflows, processes, policies, resources, and systems in which a health innovation is intended to be used. Methods such as process mapping, network analysis, needs assessments, ethnography, discourse analysis all fall into this category of context and situation analysis. This is where your qualitative and mixed methods such as surveys, key informant interviews, and focus groups that are designed to assess audience needs, circumstances, and perspectives may be used during product design. At last year's CopperCon, we had a wonderful session on assessing context from Dr. Tina Stutz here at the University of Colorado. And in our last networking lunch session, Dr. Demetria McNeil showed the archives from CopperCon over the last few years, which are publicly available for free to anyone. Strongly encourage you to go watch this wonderful session from Dr. Stutz from last year. As I mentioned, marketing and business approaches can be really helpful for crafting messages, especially elevator pitches that are meant to help support system decision-making about what innovations they'll be adopting. One of the key outputs of the customer discovery method, which is taught at the I-Core program, both here at the CCTSI and at other CTSAs nationwide and as part of the Sprint program, is the construction of value proposition statements. How do you succinctly state the value of your product to your key audience segments? Systems and complexity science methods are also, as I mentioned, really valuable for helping to understand the context in which you'll be implementing your research. Systems thinking refers to the process of understanding how things influence one another within a whole. And methods from complex adaptive systems and system dynamic mapping, which you will learn about tomorrow at CopperCon, help to map out all of these different details, all of these different components that intersect and interact as you think about, well, who's going to use this and in what context? Within communication and the arts, you might adopt social marketing theory, you might be thinking about audience segmentation, and having members of your team who can help you deconstruct and map out those different messages using social influence theories and persuasive techniques can be really valuable. And then also within communication and the arts, you might rely upon arts-based dissemination. If you've heard of data visualization, that's within that category. You could think about partnering with someone who's really good at data visualization. You might also use really creative approaches like this Journal of Applied Theater and Performance has a number of wonderful examples of doing performance art to help disseminate the products of research. As we did our review on designing for dissemination and sustainability, one of the things we realized was while there are a number of theories and frameworks out there, determinant frameworks, process frameworks, that specify how do we partner with those who might take up and use our innovations in the design and conduct of research, there was no single framework that comprehensively incorporated the notion of designing a product, a dissemination plan, and a sustainability plan, beginning with the end in mind of partnering with stakeholders, designing to fit context, and having an impact on that which might matter to those who will use your evidence. And so in a recent chapter or forthcoming chapter in the 3rd edition of the Dissemination, Implementation, Research, and Health book, we've proposed the Fit to Context framework, or the F2C framework for designing for dissemination. And here on the screen, you can see the figure for this framework. In the Fit to Context framework, we've laid out 4 phases of designing for dissemination and sustainability. The first phase is conceptualization. And the objective of the conceptualization phase is to develop our partnerships. That is first for a reason. You heard in our panel discussion this morning that if all you're looking for is input, then they don't want to work with you. We need to work together from the very beginning to make sure that the products we're designing address a need that our community partners have at the outset. The next step in conceptualization phase is to assess context and our partner priorities. This is where having a context framework like PRISM, like EPIS can be really helpful. And number 3 is to establish the evidence base. What do we already know about what works to address the priorities and needs of our community partners? In the design phase, this is where we design our research products with our partners. We plan for dissemination and plan for sustainability at the outset. Then we move into our dissemination phase. This is where we enact our active dissemination plan, and we work to enhance our system capacity for adoption and sustainment. In the last phase, the impact phase, we demonstrate impact at scale. We show using stories, using qualitative and mixed methods and quantitative evidence where it's available to show that we've achieved the impact, to describe that impact within the intended context and audience for use. But we can't necessarily expect that when we've disseminated our work, when we've demonstrated impact, that that impact will remain the same, that there will be no better evidence that ever comes to supplant it, that the context won't change. And so an important step in the impact phase is to monitor and adapt to dynamic context. Last year, we also had a presentation on a dynamic sustainability framework and a number of sessions around adaptation methods. So I encourage you to go back and watch CopperCon archives from recent years around adaptation methods. Within each of these phases, what we're trying to achieve is this notion of fit to context. That is, every stage has its own fit to context outcome that we're trying to disseminate or that we're trying to establish. The fit to context outcome within the conceptualization phase refers to demonstrating need and demand for innovation. Is this something your partners want and need? If they say no, then maybe that's not where you should be putting your effort. Also, we want to know that there is a capacity for change. I think over the last several years of the pandemic, especially in our pragmatic trials, we saw a lot that there simply wasn't capacity for anything new or different. They want this, there's a need for it, but they just can't handle anything new. Something else has to go before there's room or capacity for some new innovation, for us to try anything different. You want to make sure that when you're approaching a new research initiative, that you're thinking about it from the perspective of, is there a capacity to do anything different right now? And then understanding context is, I keep coming back to this, you need to understand that context, and in particular, what are the equity factors that you need to address? What are the potential harms that could be done? How might you create disparity rather than alleviate disparity through your research? Make sure you're understanding those equity factors at the outset of your research initiative. In the design phase, the fit to context outcomes include demonstration that your product is perceived as feasible, acceptable, useful, equitable. There's a number of different frameworks that you might bring to mind. You know, the technology acceptance model would have you demonstrate that you have usable and useful technologies that are arising from your design process. You also want to ensure that your sustainability and dissemination plans align with context. If you're bringing the PRISM contextual framework to understanding context in your project, then you'll be understanding the sustainability infrastructure that relates to whatever the product is that you're designing. Are the payment models in the region, in the organization where you expect this program to be used, is that aligned with how we pay for this program or who staffs this program or how it's administered. In the dissemination phase, the fit to context is that you've demonstrated awareness among your intended audience. Are you actually reaching those who you would expect to adopt and use and sustain your program or your product? Have you demonstrated intention to adopt and sustain? And have you demonstrated that there is the ability to have equitable access to care? In the impact phase, fit to context refers to broad and equitable adoption, that you've actually seen that people have translated their intention into action, that organizations and systems have put their money where their mouth is, and that they are actually doing what they've said they would do. That you're seeing consistent implementation and sustained impact on health and equity over time. This is not something that you can demonstrate once and walk away. The ongoing commitment to demonstrating impact, adapting to changing context is a necessary step in this process. So just to reiterate briefly, fit to context refers to ensuring the products of research are culturally appropriate, can be used in resource limited settings, align with the strengths and assets of the intended audience and setting, and impact outcomes that matter to communities and potential adopters and influencers. Fit to context outcomes, what are we actually measuring, refers to an assessment of the extent to which the research product, dissemination plan, or sustainability plan exhibit fit to context relevant to each phase, that they match the needs, resources, workflows, and contextual characteristics of the target audience and setting, that you've demonstrated problem solution fit, that you've demonstrated relative advantage, compatibility, complexity, observability. Those are outcomes from diffusion of innovation theory, if you're applying that theory. Very commonly used these days, perceived acceptability, appropriateness, and feasibility of your intervention. Cultural appropriateness, sort of poorly defined concept of implementability. Is this something that we can implement right now? Do we have the capacity to do this? Do we have the organizational readiness to do this? Is it sustainable? One of the things that we talked about last year, Dr. Luke presented last year on his program sustainability assessment tool, which is available at sustaintool.org. That is my favorite way of assessing the potential sustainability of a program. He's also recently introduced, or he and his team recently introduced, the clinical sustainability assessment tool, which is great for thinking about clinical services. I already mentioned the value of perceived usefulness and usability and user satisfaction methods anytime you have a technology or a device, and noting that your communication channels are aligned with how the intended audience receives information, and that your sustainability plans are aligned with business models and payment models. And in the interest of time, I think I'm going to skip over my case example. It will be available on the website if you'd like to review it, because I do want to get to some questions and answers. So I'd like to have a Q&A session around how might you adopt a designing for dissemination, sustainability, and equity perspective in your own research. Having you think about how to change your mindset, considering who will use your product, under what circumstances, and to address what urgent need, to design studies to test your product in and for that context, yes, even efficacy trials, test them in context, expect the need to pivot and adapt over time, especially as your context changes, to think about enhancing your skills in team science approaches, the systems and infrastructure that may need to be enhanced in order to actually conduct your research, and strategies for incentivizing dissemination beyond academic journals and conference presentations. So with that, let's have some Q&A. Anyone? So we have a question here in the chat while Jordan is running the microphone up there. Amy says, I really appreciate the fit to context framework and its focus on dissemination. As we seek to disseminate and sustain evidence-based programs, how do we rapidly assess context at baseline and over time? Is providing the CSAT or the PSAT to an array of receptor sites enough? Rapid dissemination and designing for dissemination can sometimes be absolutely critical, as we've seen throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. We don't have a lot of time. And so one of the things that we've done in our MAB project, and there's a presentation about that this afternoon, is this notion of we are simultaneously engaging our partners in designing the messages, in conducting the research needed to demonstrate efficacy, and at the same time, understanding context. So we do those two things in parallel, and then we update our prototypes, we update our dissemination strategies as we learn more. We can worry that all of these earlier phases, the conceptualization and the design phases, could take years and years to develop. How do we do that more quickly to make sure that people are benefiting from the products of our research more quickly? And so these rapid prototyping models, accepting that they won't be perfect, that they won't get the message straight right at the very beginning, and tolerating that need for adaptation and pivoting over time can be a really useful tactic to bring. So Jen had a question.
Yes, and this one is not exactly what you're looking for, but I have a question about bringing the community together.
Mhm.
And have you ever seen where you've brought the community together, asked them what it is their needs are, then went out for the grant and tried to get something?
Absolutely. And so there are a number of strategies to first begin with the community and their needs, to engage them in the process of identifying their research priorities. In fact, the community-based participatory research approach firmly places the prioritization for research within the community and what it is that they want. And that can be very challenging for researchers who say, I have this wonderful idea. I think I know the problem. I'm going to go write this grant, and then I'll engage my community. And how do we actually do this research? And there are certainly strategies for doing that. There's nothing inherently wrong with coming up with an idea and putting forth a research proposal to study it and then engaging your partners. You have to start somewhere, especially if your area of expertise is in one particular area. I find that it can be very difficult to go to the community and say, okay, what problems are you experiencing? And then they say something that is so far outside the realm of my expertise that I don't know how to deal with that. That's just not something I know about. But then if I've gone through that process of identifying their priorities, making those connections to other colleagues, to other experts in the field, and doing what I can to help them gain the capacity to actually follow through and design research that matters to them. But ideally, absolutely, you're identifying community needs and perspectives at the outset, and then writing your grants to actually study them. Stan says starting programs requires trust and visibility, and that it's hard to do in a short time. And he says, I think I'm addressing that observation now. Yes, absolutely. We can't let perfect be the enemy of good enough, and we need to get in front of our engaged partners early and often. It's also really fun working with community partners. It's really fulfilling. And thinking about the impact that matters to them, even when you feel like, oh gosh, the numbers just aren't there. But to be partnering with community members who say, just going through this process has been valuable, to have our voices heard. Sometimes that in and of itself can be empowering and can be a positive impact. Arthur says, thank you for pointing out the inappropriateness of the use of the word stakeholder, particularly for First Nations people. And how have you grappled with this in the past with the changing landscape? Arthur, language is hard. And this came up in a recent partner engagement meeting that we had, it was just last week, where I made this point as we were thinking about a patient representative engagement activity. And one of our patient partners had a very visceral reaction when I said we really shouldn't be using this term anymore. And he was angry, he was upset. He's like, well, why does this matter? Why do we need to be so politically correct? And we continued with our conversation, and he went and he Googled it. And he realized that there actually is quite a sordid history of the use of the term stakeholder. And he apologized and said, I see now, I see why that's not appropriate. And changing language can be very difficult. It becomes so firmly ingrained in how we speak and how we conceptualize our research. And when we see the true origin, the true basis of our language, and it represents the exact opposite of what we're trying to achieve in this case, equity and engagement of those that we care deeply about, then we can do better. Are we out of time?
Still have 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay, great. Okay. Monica says D4DS requires expertise on system dynamic modeling and systems mapping. Often this expertise is hard to find. And what's been my approach or recommendations to partner with experts in this area on an ongoing basis? And how do we translate this area of expertise to our community partners during planning and design? I am not the expert on this. And in fact, when planning this conference, that was what I struggled with the most. It is not an area that I know very much about. And so I went to my colleagues. I went to those who presented in previous years at CopperCon on systems science. I went to Doug and said, who's the expert on this topic? What are the different perspectives? Who do I need to bring in? What is this? And so relying upon my networks of colleagues, relying upon people to put me in touch with someone who can speak to this issue from all the different perspectives, as with all team science, that would be my recommendation. Talia Thompson says, I'm glad you acknowledge the critical piece of community capacity for change. And how do you respectfully engage with community when community members have very limited time and bandwidth, but passion and desire to engage? This is a really good question and something I struggle with a lot. I have some community partners who are there for it all the time. I have a patient partner who had brain surgery last week. And when I talked to her last night, she said, this is really important work. I want to come back to work tomorrow. And we said, please don't, just heal, just get better. And then there are others who are very passionate, but they just don't have time. And so we meet people where they are. I'm sure you've all heard that language, meeting people where they're at, however much they're able and willing to give, in whatever way they're willing to give it. We have some people that we partner with that want to come to all of the meetings. They want to engage through all of the social media channels. They're very extroverted people. And then we have other people who care just as much, but they're very introverted. They have busy jobs. They have busy lives. They have severe health conditions and limited cognitive capacity and challenges with communication. Their perspectives are still very much needed. And so how do we work with them? By creating a relationship so that we can have ready communication, that we invite them in to participate in any way that they can. Let's see. Arthur put a great link in the chat about 9 terms to avoid in communication with Indigenous people. Thank you very much, Arthur. All right. Any other questions or comments before we wrap up? Okay. If you want to reach me, I am at Bethany Kwan on Twitter, or you can email me. Happy to answer any questions you might have. Oh, here, a couple more questions. How can my community partners include experts and families? How can we consider mental and behavioral health outcomes? I mean, as with all designing for dissemination, be developing your relationships, your partnerships with those who already work in this area would be my recommendation. Changing language for how to collect social determinants of health data and ask to talk about diversity. Absolutely, we need to be culturally appropriate. How do we define culture? That is a very big question. I don't know the answer. And But again, it really does come down to working with communities and being open to being corrected, to changing your language, to seeking fit between the language that we're using within research and the language of our communities that welcome them in rather than put them off. Okay. All right, well, thank you all so much. I believe we have a short break and then we'll have our concurrent sessions this afternoon.